I never thought I'd find myself working as a security guard at a cemetery. But my dwindling bank account and the promise of a decent paycheck led me to Necropolis, a cemetery that I never knew existed. If it weren't for the ad I received while browsing the web, I wouldn't have found it. Clicking on the ad took me to a website that looked like something 13-year-old me would create as my first web page. I quickly skimmed through their page and saw that they have an email I can contact if I was interested in any of their job openings. I sent an email asking for an interview for their security guard role, and within 5 minutes, I got an email back saying that they would like to interview me next week. I continued my life, almost forgetting that I had an interview if it weren't for the phone reminder I set up beforehand. I was dreaming of finally having a job that pays well on the drive to the cemetery. I was convinced that I'd spend my nights patrolling empty pathways and snoozing off in my guardhouse, all while getting paid for it. Reaching the cemetery for my interview wasn't much of a hassle. The cemetery was located within a 20-minute drive from the almost devoid house that I resided in. It was situated in a forested area of the small town that I live in. After parking my car and reaching the front gates, I was met by a tall fellow with a wrinkled and aged face who went by the name of Mr. Damien. He wore an elegant black suit, black pants, black shoes, a black bowler hat, and he held a cane in his left hand. He welcomed me to the cemetery and told me he was the owner of it and that it had been passed down in his family for generations. Even though he said nothing that sounded wrong, he, in a way, felt wrong. I sensed a creepy aura from him. Now, I'm not one to judge people, nor do I believe in intelligent life forms that are non-human, but he felt off. He walked with a limp, talked slowly with a heavy gasp for air in between words, and was void of expression. It's as if he were an entity attempting to look and behave like a human. Shrugging this off as him being weird, I mean, come on, the dude owns a cemetery. I followed him beyond the entrance gates. All while he asked me a few questions, all of which were ordinary questions you would expect in a job interview. We reached the end of the cemetery when he asked me the only question that stood out.
Do you believe in the afterlife, Mr. Ingram?
I was taken aback by this question, but I answered with all honesty. No, I don't, sir. He paused for a moment, before nodding and holding out his right hand, which I shook. He showed me around the cemetery. It was guarded by a 7-foot iron fence, and there was only one way to enter or exit the cemetery, through the main entrance. In the middle of the cemetery stood 2 buildings, a small, old, and weathered chapel, and a much larger and more well-preserved mausoleum. Inside the chapel is what you would expect: an altar, 2 ambos, a few altar crosses, mini pews for seating, an organ, and a carpet that ran from the door of the chapel towards the altar seated at the end of the chapel. The chapel itself looked very run down. The inside had gathered a lot of dust, and there were spiderwebs everywhere. It looked like it hadn't been touched since the day that it was built. The mausoleum was different. It was very clean, and I could tell that it was very well maintained. It was a large structure, and the inside sheltered many stone sarcophagus. They were lined up in 3 columns, with each column housing a dozen stone caskets. A golden plaque was affixed to the top of each of the entombments, with the name, date of birth, and date of death of the buried on it. Outside the two structures were, as you would expect, graves. Many looked old and weathered, and a few looked clean and polished. And a stone pathway revolved around a few areas of the cemetery. Finally, I was shown the place I was going to spend the majority of my time, the guardhouse. It was basically a small room with windows overlooking the entrance to the cemetery, the chapel, and the mausoleum. Inside the guardhouse was a chair, a table with a vintage radio on it, a clock on the wall, a jacket/coat hanger, and a door that leads to a small bathroom. Mr. Damien told me to enjoy the rest of my day and that I would start my first shift later that night at 10 p.m. I got in my car and drove home to rest a bit before beginning my first shift. On my way back to the cemetery later that day, I was a bit anxious. I wasn't scared. I had no reason to be. But I felt like I wasn't given enough information by Mr. Damien. On top of this, wasn't I supposed to sign any contracts or papers stating I was now an employee of the cemetery? Anyway, I had already accepted the job, and now it was time to earn an easy paycheck. Or so I assumed. I reached the cemetery where I was greeted by the security guard whose shift had just ended. He gave me the keys to the chapel, the mausoleum, the guardhouse, and the cemetery entrance before wishing me luck. He even insisted that I would need it. I made my way into the guardhouse and found a white piece of paper on the table and a security guard outfit still in its packaging right next to it. I took off the clothes I was wearing and then put on the job outfit I now had. I picked up the note and read it out loud. It stated the following. Your shift begins at 10 p.m. and ends at 6 a.m. You are to follow the following rules if you wish your shift to be a successful one. Rule 1. The cemetery closes at 12 a.m. No visitors are allowed to enter after it closes. Once the clock hits 12 a.m., walk around the cemetery and make sure that any visitors already inside the vicinity of the cemetery leave the area immediately. Rule 2. A tall, bald male with dark brown eyes and a white goatee will stand right at the entrance gate of the cemetery. You should let this man inside the cemetery without talking to him. His presence will not be felt, so he will not disturb you. Rule 3. Between 1:15 a.m. and 5:30 a.m., you may hear an organ start to play from within the chapel, and the lights of the chapel may begin to flicker. Do not worry, you have no reason to be afraid unless you enter the chapel during this time? What? Rule 4. You may hear noises from the mausoleum at any time during your shift. Do not approach the mausoleum during this time, no matter what noise you hear or how loud you hear them. They will eventually subside on their own. Rule 5. At 2 a.m. you may hear knocking on the door of the guardhouse. Open the door and you will either be greeted by a weeping girl or a disfigured male. If the weeping girl was the cause of the knocking, escort her to the mausoleum, unlock the door for her, and make sure to lock the door after she enters the mausoleum. If it is the disfigured male who was the cause of the knocking on the door, close the guardhouse door and lock it the moment you see him. Either turn your head away from all the windows or close your eyes and wait until the knocking comes to a full stop. Only then can you resume your shift like nothing happened. What is this? Rule 6. If the weeping girl knocks on the door and you hear noises coming from the mausoleum, let the girl into the guardhouse instead. And wait until you no longer hear any noises coming from the mausoleum, then refer back to Rule 5. Rule 7. It is mandatory that you leave the guardhouse before 4:20 a.m. You are free to do anything while still abiding by all the above rules during that time. During this time, you will feel like you are being watched. At any moment, you might run into a few people roaming around the grave sites. If this is the case, avoid eye contact and don't interact with them at all costs. You are allowed back into the guardhouse by 4:50 a.m. Enter the guardhouse by 5 a.m. At this point, you are not allowed anywhere else outside of the main room of the guardhouse, not even the bathroom. If for whatever reason you cannot enter the guardhouse before 5 a.m., run into the chapel and lock the door behind you. Inside the chapel, search for the bald man and remain close to him at all times. Do not talk to him or touch him in any way. Simply stay within conversing distance of him. They will not harm you if you stay next to him. Rule 9. By 6 a.m., open the gates of the cemetery and wait for the next security guard to take over. Your shift is not over until the next guard arrives or until it's 8 a.m. Do not leave the cemetery until the next guard arrives or it's 8 a.m. Rule 10. If no guard arrives by 8 a.m., you are free to leave, but not before you go into the chapel where you will find the bald man from earlier. Tell him that your shift is over but no guard has taken over yet. Once he acknowledges that, you are free to leave until your next shift begins. As I settled into the chair, I reread the note again and again. It can't be real, can it? It had to be some sort of prank. Either left by the last security guard to take over or by Mr. Damien. Either way, it was odd to say the least.
They will not harm you if you stay next to him.
Who are they? Why would there be people inside the cemetery after it closes? I thought about it for a bit before coming to the conclusion that I should follow those rules. After all, they may just be testing me, seeing if I'm capable of following the rules they give me. I sat in the guardhouse for 2 hours before venturing out into the exterior of the cemetery. I did as the piece of paper said. I made sure the cemetery was empty of all life, apart from me, before settling into the guardhouse again. I played around with the radio, and to my surprise, the vintage radio crackled to life, emitting a static hiss that seemed to harmonize with the darkening atmosphere. I quickly turned it off afterwards because the sound became too agonizing to listen to. From within the guardhouse, I saw a tall silhouette in the distance, right next to where the main entrance is. It seemed to be a person standing behind the gate, outside the cemetery. I didn't understand why somebody would want access to the cemetery at this time before I remembered the paper I read earlier. I picked up the paper and read it again, making sure to pay attention to every letter on the paper. Rule 2. When the clock strikes 1 a.m., a tall bald male with dark brown eyes and a white goatee will stand right at the entrance gate to the cemetery. You should let this man inside the cemetery without talking to him. His presence will not be felt, so he will not disturb you. I got up from my chair and headed out into the open. I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that crept over me. Like an invisible presence watching my every move. I made my way down to the entrance, and as I got closer, I could tell that this was the same man the paper was referring to. Tall, bald, white goatee, black clothes, and black gloves. He was taller than I expected, and his clothing made me think he was a gravekeeper. I nodded at the man as I opened the gate and let him in. He had his eyes fixated on the chapel the entire time. After walking into the cemetery, he hastily made his way into the chapel, where I saw him unlock the door and disappear into the darkness inside. To say I was scared was an understatement. My heart was racing, I was sweating profusely, and my brain was begging me to leave, that the job wasn't worth it. I felt like I was the dumb character in every horror movie who does nothing but make bad decisions all day long. Something felt off. He didn't blink. He didn't make a noise. It was like I was standing right next to a ghost. I shook off the feeling of dread. No matter how weird all of this may seem, the job was paying well. The minutes passed slowly, and the air grew thick with tension as I made my way back into the guardhouse, making sure that both the cemetery gates and the guardhouse door were locked. I reread the paper again. I could feel the weight of the rules pressing down on me. It was as if the cemetery held secrets that I was forbidden to uncover. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the sound of an organ began to echo from within the chapel's walls. I could hear it even inside the guardhouse. Panic surged through me, but I fought to maintain my composure, leaving a mental note to myself to stay far away from the source of the haunting melody. I peeked through the windows to find the flickering lights outside the chapel dancing like ethereal flames, casting an otherworldly glow that seemed to beckon me closer. I stared intensely, sweat forming on my brow as the music intensified, sending ripples of anxiety through my soul. It was as if something magical was transpiring within those walls. Suddenly, the guardhouse door shook under the force of a single knock, causing me to jump. I hesitated for a while before opening the door, dread gnawing at my insides. And there before me stood a weeping girl. Her face streaked with tears, a sorrow that seemed to pierce my heart. Summoning my courage, I ushered her towards the mausoleum, all while the organ played a dreamy tune that resonated inside my head. We reached the mausoleum, and I quickly unlocked the door. As I stood by the door, I saw her figure vanish into the darkness of the structure, and I quickly locked the door behind her, my heart pounding. Mentally repeating the rules in my mind, I returned to the guardhouse. The night wore on, each minute passing with agonizing slowness. Shadows seemed to move with a life of their own, and the hushed whispers of the wind carried a symphony of voices that seemed distant yet close. I fought to keep my wits about me, making sure to keep the piece of paper with all the rules on it close to me at all times. As the clock approached 4:20 a.m., a shiver ran down my spine. I ventured outside, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move, observing me as if they were a predator and I were prey, waiting for the right moment to pounce on me. I thought I saw figures move amongst the gravestones, ethereal and haunting, their forms shifting like apparitions in the mist. Was it my mind playing games on me? Or were these apparitions of some sort? I made sure to steer clear of any area where I thought I saw someone or something move. I returned to the guardhouse a minute before 5 a.m., feeling a sense of relief wash over me. I settled into my post, the clock ticking away the final hour of my shift. But the anticipation of what lay ahead gnawed at me, while the feeling of unease made me want to run back to my car and drive home. As the night grew quieter, the seconds stretched into minutes, and I heard the last of the organ. I sat at the guardhouse, unmoving, waiting for the time to pass. At last, 6 a.m. arrived, and I opened the cemetery gates, awaiting the next security guard to take over. Within 10 minutes, I was driving back home, awaiting my next shift. Necropolis has a dark secret behind it. No one can tell me otherwise. The bald man, the haunting melody, the weeping girl, the moving shadows that I saw, they are real. And I will find out what they all mean in due time. But, for now, I rest until my next shift is upon me. The next morning was a blur as I tried to process the events of that first night. It felt like a dream, a bizarre nightmare that left me questioning my sanity. I used all the free time I had to search for clues, details, or any information about Necropolis. But I only found 2 references about them online. The first was a news article written on June 19th, 2009. It detailed how Necropolis was once a privately owned cemetery that belonged to the Abaddon family, an immigrant family that came to our town sometime after World War II, but vanished without a trace on June 13th, 1955. Only their youngest daughter was found badly bruised and malnourished right outside the gates of the cemetery. A day later, the cemetery was burned to the ground, and all that remained was buried in a mass grave by the locals for fear of awakening any demons. Many theories arose, ranging from a kidnapping to a supposed cult sacrifice to a suicide-homicide situation. But to this day, the disappearance remains a mystery. Using the information I learned from the first reference, I tracked a user profile on social media with the name of Molly Abaddon. Her profile didn't have any information whatsoever. She had no likes, posts, and was following no one. Her profile banner and icon were the default ones you'd automatically get when creating a profile on this page. However, she was being followed by a single account with the name Molly Brown. That profile had posts, comments, likes, and whatnot. The latest post was a picture of a cute puppy, posted just 2 days ago. Doing more research on public databases, I found out that there was only one person within 300 miles whose last name was Abaddon. At least that is what her last name was before she got married and changed it to Brown. The person I found was a 76-year-old widow. So, it matches up with when the Abaddon family came to this town. Skimming through the profile I found, I pieced together where I thought she lived. Now yes, I know that is very invasive of me, but I need to know more about Necropolis, and it doesn't require a genius to know that this person is related to the cemetery and its history. I sent Molly a friend request, and waited for her to accept or decline it. I eventually dozed off for a few hours before awakening to a knocking on my front door. I checked my phone. It was 9:24 p.m. I hadn't ordered anything, so who could be at my door, I wondered. I waited a few moments before the knocking stopped, and a white piece of paper slid underneath my door. I picked up the paper, and on it was written, "Make any further contact with her, and there will be unpleasant repercussions." The words on that piece of paper sent a shiver down my spine. No doubt whoever had left this message knew about my research into Molly Abaddon and her connection to Necropolis. My mind raced with thoughts of who could have left this warning. Was it Mr. Damien? Was it someone else involved with the mysterious occurrences in the cemetery? The idea that someone was watching me, monitoring my actions, filled me with a deep sense of unease. I stared at the message, my thoughts racing. I knew I needed to be cautious, to tread carefully. Whoever was behind this was clearly intent on keeping secrets hidden, and I had inadvertently stumbled upon something much bigger than I could have imagined. The feeling of being trapped, of being entangled in a web of mystery and danger, closed in around me. I felt as if I were a chess piece trapped in a game. I was weak, and it seemed as if I had no control over what I could and couldn't do. How did they know that I wanted to contact Molly? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose, and the more I regretted accepting the job. Do I take the risk and contact Molly, or do I abide by their rules like the pawn I am? Do I leave this pathetic town I live in and attempt to escape from it all, or do I uncover the truth of Necropolis? My mind raced to find a solution, and by the time I thought of an idea, it was already time for my next shift. I decided that whatever the history of Necropolis is, it would be my job to warn others about it and possibly put an end to it. I was already too deep, so I may as well take this entire place and its history down with me. Eventually, I gathered my courage, and I found myself once again driving through the forest towards Necropolis. The memory of the tall bald man and the weeping girl haunted my thoughts. The eerie melody of the organ lingered in my mind, and the note I received kept reminding me to tread carefully. I parked my car and started at the entrance gates, my heart racing. I knew there was no turning back now. I entered the cemetery to find Mr. Damien waiting by the door of the guardhouse. I hesitantly made my way toward him. All the while, thoughts of the note occupied my mind. The few seconds it took to reach Mr. Damien felt like an eternity. And his presence was just as unsettling as the first time I met him. He greeted me with a nod, his lips curling into a faint smile that never reached his eyes. That was the first time I saw his face display any sort of expression.
"Remember the rules, Mr. Ingram,"
he said, his voice like a whisper that seemed to echo in my mind.
"Follow them to the letter, and you will be safe, unlike the guard who relieved you of your first shift."
A slight yet mischievous smile started to develop on his face. I nodded, my throat dry as I replied, "Yes, I understand." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing beyond the gates of the cemetery. I watched him go, a feeling of dread starting in the pit of my stomach. I took a deep breath and stepped into the guardhouse, the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. My mind repeated his words.
Remember the rules, Mr. Ingram. Follow them to the letter, and you will be safe. Unlike the guard who relieved you of your first shift.
No doubt, that guard got killed. But in what way, I hope to never find out. The guardhouse felt even smaller this time, its walls closing in on me. I changed into the security guard outfit and picked up the piece of paper. The words now etched into my memory. The rules were bizarre, nonsensical even, but I will follow them, no matter what. As the clock struck 10 p.m., I settled into the chair, my eyes fixated on the vintage radio. I hesitated before turning it on, and this time, the crackling static felt like a familiar companion. The eerie sound seemed to fill the guardhouse, mingling with the tension that hung in the air. I tried to distract myself by staring out the window, my gaze fixed on the chapel in the distance. The memory of the previous night's event flooded my mind, and I shivered despite the warmth of the room. How had I let myself get into this situation? As per Rule 1, I walked out of the guardhouse and into the chilling cold outside, patrolling the grave sites and ensuring that there were no visitors on this side of the gates. I made my way back into the guardhouse once the cemetery was free of outsiders. Minutes turned into hours, and the air grew thick with anticipation. Every creak and rustle seemed magnified, and I found myself jumping at the slightest sound. I glanced at the clock. My heart sank as the hands inched closer to 1 a.m. I got out of the guardhouse when I first saw him again, the bald man. I walked to the gates of the cemetery and let him in. Just like last time, he made no noise, had his eyes transfixed on the chapel, and he didn't seem to acknowledge my presence. I made sure to stay out of his way and not talk to him as he entered the chapel and closed the door behind him. Instead of going back to the chapel, I made my way to the mausoleum. The tall structure stood before me, and I felt weak, small, and scared as hell. It felt almost like I was staring up at my creator. I unlocked and opened the door to the mausoleum, and with a heavy gasp, I made my way in. I closed the door behind me before beginning to look around inside. I didn't know why I was there, but it felt like the right decision. I was looking for something, but I didn't even know what it was. I read the golden plaques affixed on top of the sarcophagus. They had the names, dates of birth, and dates of death of the bodies entombed within them. I read the last one when I made a realization. None of the sarcophagi housed a person who died past 1955. The most recent date of death I read was on June 10th, 1955. Just 3 days before the Abaddons vanished. Suddenly, I heard a noise. The organ's haunting melody began to fill the air. This time, it sounded sad, tragic, as if it were telling a mournful story. On the first night, it sounded eerie, like a warning. This time, sounded like a goodbye. Its mournful notes sent shivers down my spine. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to run. I remembered the rules, to stay away from the chapel during this time. Fortunately for me, the mausoleum isn't that close to the chapel. I walked around the interior for a bit, searching for anything out of the ordinary, when I found it. A single stone, slightly extending outside of the wall facing the entrance of the mausoleum. This seemed odd to me because the mausoleum was perfect. That wasn't an exaggeration. The place was perfect. Apart from this one stone, the place felt almost too perfect. It was too clean, too new. The smell wasn't good nor bad. The linings and drawings on the wall were perfect. Every centimeter of the structure was perfect. Apart from that single piece of stone sticking out of the wall. My heart raced as I stared at the protruding stone. It seemed out of place in the sea of pristine perfection that was the mausoleum. I knew instinctively that there was something hidden behind that brick. Something that wasn't meant to be discovered. I hesitated for a moment, the tragic organ music echoing in my ears. The rule never stated anything against me entering the mausoleum unless I heard noises coming from within. Fortunately for me, the only noises in this structure were my own. Either way, my curiosity got the better of me. With a mixture of fear and determination, I pushed on the brick, feeling slight resistance before it gave way and slid into the wall. The title was embossed in faded gold letters. Chronicles of Necropolis. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the book. The sense of danger was palpable, and I felt as if I were on the precipice of uncovering something far beyond my mortal comprehension. I knew that reading this book will probably reveal secrets that were meant to stay buried. But my curiosity was insatiable. With trembling hands, I opened the book to its first page and began to read. The entries were written in an elegant cursive script dated back over a few decades. The tales within spoke of rituals, sacrifices, and a pact made with dark forces in exchange for wealth, power, and longevity. As I read, I began to realize the true nature of Necropolis. It was not just a cemetery. It was a nexus of spiritual energy. A place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. The Abaddon family, driven by greed and ambition, had made a pact with an entity known as the Keeper of Souls. The entity granted them the means to accumulate wealth and power in exchange for the souls of the deceased buried within the cemetery. Over time, the Abaddons had used the souls to prolong their lives, ensuring their immortality while causing suffering to those whose remains were bound to Necropolis. The rituals conducted in the chapel were not just for show. They were part of a larger design to maintain the link between the living and the dead, to harness the energy of the souls and fuel their twisted desires. Eventually, not enough souls were available to be harnessed by the Keeper of the Souls. So he took most of the family's souls and only left Molly alive, badly bruised and malnourished, as a warning for others to heed. The land Necropolis once stood on was eventually bought back by someone who reconstructed and reopened the cemetery. The book doesn't say who that person is. The more I read, the more I realized the magnitude of the darkness that had enveloped Necropolis. The weeping girl I had encountered, the apparitions, and the haunting melody of the organ. They were all connected to the malevolent power that lingered within the cemetery. As I delved deeper into the pages, I learned of the curse that had been placed upon the Abaddon bloodline. The curse ensured that they could never leave Necropolis, bound to the very place they had profaned. The Keeper of Souls had turned them into eternal guardians of the cemetery, cursed to protect the dark secret they had unleashed. My heart raced as the truth settled over me like a suffocating shroud. I had unwittingly stepped into a battle between the forces of darkness and those who sought to free the trapped souls. The warning I had received, the veiled threats, it was all a desperate attempt to keep the truth hidden. With every page I turned, I realized the magnitude of my role in this story. I was not just an observer. I was a potential disruptor of the twisted balance that had been maintained for generations. I could be the key to freeing the souls trapped within Necropolis. Or I could be the catalyst for even greater suffering. Or I could also be the next to join the suffering. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest as I read further into the Chronicles of Necropolis. The truth was like a weight on my shoulders, and I felt the gravity of the decision I had to make. I had a hard choice to make, a choice that could determine the fate of the souls trapped within the Necropolis and my own destiny as well. Would I risk my sanity, my life, and my soul to free those who once rested easily? My heart sank as I thought of my options. No matter what I did, I had to do it soon. Hastily, I took as many pictures of the pages of the book as I could before I returned it to where I originally found it, making sure to place the stone hiding it in its place as well. I then left the mausoleum and locked the door behind me before returning to the guardhouse. All the while, the organ inside the chapel played a glum tune that echoed within my head. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That the very darkness itself was alive with hidden eyes. The words of the book echoed in my head. The stories of rituals and curses. I had become a part of something beyond my understanding. A battle between supernatural forces that I had never believed in. I glanced at the clock. My heart sank as the minutes ticked closer to 2 a.m. The dread grew within me, and my mind raced with thoughts of the weeping girl and the disfigured man. Rules 5 and 6 played out in my head, and I knew that my actions could have dire consequences. As expected, right as the clock ticked 2 a.m., a soft knock on the door of the guardhouse made my heart jump. I hesitated, unsure of what I would find on the other side. I slowly approached the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. With a deep breath, I swung the door open, revealing the figure before me. It was the weeping girl. Just like on my first shift, her face obscured by tears, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the night. She looked at me with pleading eyes, and my heart ached at the sight of her torment. I had a choice to make, a choice that could alter the course of this night. Following the rules had brought me this far, but now I stood at a crossroads. Rule 5 instructed me to lead her to the mausoleum, to unlock the door and let her in. But was there another way? What if I could break the cycle? defied the darkness that had ensnared her and so many others. The organ continued its mournful melody, the haunting notes growing louder in my ears. Time seemed to stand still as I grappled with my decision. My heart ached for her suffering, but the book's revelations warned of the dangers that lay within Necropolis. I decided to do as the rules said. I took the girl to the mausoleum, opened the door for her, and locked it after making sure she went in. I made my way back to the guardhouse while the organ subsided, and all I could hear was myself. I felt dreadful. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a pawn in a malevolent game, my every move orchestrated by forces beyond my control. The air in the guardhouse felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on me. I sat there, my thoughts a jumbled mess, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. The night dragged on, and the sense of unease never left me. The minutes stretched into hours, and as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, I knew that my shift was coming to an end. Yet the nightmare I'm trapped in wore on. At last, 6 a.m. came, and I was making my way to the entrance of the cemetery when something came to my attention. The bald man stood right outside the chapel. He held something in his hand as he looked directly at me. It was the book. He held the book I had found inside the mausoleum, and he was staring right at me. I made an attempt not to notice the book and nodded at him before turning to the entrance of the cemetery and unlocking it. I opened the gates of the cemetery, got in my car, and left to go home. On the drive home, I felt like I did something wrong. Only when I arrived back home did I remember. Rule 9. By 6 a.m., open the gates of the cemetery and wait for the next security guard to take over. Your shift is not over until the next guard arrives or it's 8 a.m. Do not leave the cemetery until the next guard arrives or it's 8 a.m. I checked the time. It was 6:31 a.m. I broke a rule, and with each heartbeat, my fear grew stronger. The clock read 6:33 a.m., and I was trapped in a web of uncertainty. There was no one to turn to, no clear path forward. They say that facing your demons is a brave act, but a lot of times it feels like a foolish one. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I had to confront this head on. Back at Necropolis, I parked my car near the gates, my mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. The air was thick with tension as I stepped into the cemetery once more. Perhaps they were already aware of my transgression, and now I had to face the consequences. Or maybe I could somehow bargain for a chance at peace, a twisted negotiation with the forces that held me captive. The familiar surroundings of Necropolis loomed, both ominous and strangely welcoming. Rule number 10 echoed in my mind. If no guard arrives by 8 a.m., you are free to leave, but not before you go into the chapel where you will find the bald man from earlier. Tell him that your shift is over, but no guard has taken over yet. Once he acknowledges that, you are free to leave until your next shift begins. I had departed the cemetery earlier than scheduled, leaving my post vacant. Could this be my lifeline? A way to connect with the enigmatic bald man. With a mix of hope and trepidation, I entered the chapel. The door was already open, inviting me into its shadowed depths. And there he was, the bald man, a sentinel in this twisted realm. Silently I approached him, his back turned as if he was waiting for me. The intensity of the moment pushed my heartbeat into my throat. Each step weighted with uncertainty. I was ready for anything, ready to fight or flee if necessary. But then, as if sensing my presence, he rose from his seat, turned to face me, and his inscrutable eyes locked onto mine. A silent command passed between us, and I followed him to the door of the chapel. What choice did I have? I was drawn into his orbit, a player in a game I still didn't fully understand. The tension was palpable as I walked in his wake, the weight of his gaze heavy on my back. There was a shared understanding that words were unnecessary. The bald man's presence spoke volumes. Through the doorway and into the mausoleum we went, our footsteps barely audible against the backdrop of silence. He led me to a specific spot, a wall that held hidden secrets. With a practiced motion, he pressed a stone, revealing a hidden compartment that housed the book. The same book that taught me of the wretched truth behind this place. He took out a pen and began to write. The scratching of the pen on paper seemed to echo throughout the mausoleum, a sound both mundane and otherworldly. The finality of his actions weighed heavily on me, the anticipation nearly unbearable. And then, as the last stroke of the pen met the paper, he handed me the book. What would later become a guide to my uncertain fate, my path illuminated by his cryptic words. I held the book as if it were a lifeline, my fingers trembling against the pages that now held my destiny. The words written there pulled me in, unraveling the mystery that had gripped Necropolis for so long. The bald man's guidance was stark and direct, a beacon in the enveloping darkness. A shiver ran down my spine as I read, realizing that my defiance had shaken the curse's foundation. The Keeper of Souls, a malevolent entity feasting on fear and suffering, was now vulnerable. The bald man's instructions were clear. 3 objects hidden within Necropolis held the key to ending the curse. A ritual, a confrontation with the Keeper. It was a daunting task laid out before me. And yet, hope glimmered in his words. A fragile promise that the tormented souls could find their salvation and I would be set free from this place. The bald man's message warned of the shadows that would conspire against me, and the Keeper's determination to thwart my efforts. Trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, and my resolve had to remain unshaken. The key he handed me afterwards felt cold in my hand, its weight a reminder of the responsibility I now carried. His final words were etched into my mind, a declaration of my irrevocable connection to the cursed Necropolis. The crypt beckoned, its darkness promising both answers and challenges. Where can I find this crypt? I asked, determination in my voice. The bald man walked over to the sarcophagus furthest away from the door and opened the lid with ease. To my amazement, there was a ladder leading down, beneath the mausoleum and into the crypt. Eventually, as if sensing my hesitation, the bald man turned away, his figure disappearing into the outside of the mausoleum. I was left standing there, clutching the book and the key, knowing that I was now bound to a destiny that was intertwined with the very fabric of Necropolis. The bald man's writing etched itself into my mind as I stood before the open sarcophagus, its dark depths beckoning me. The weight of the book and key in my hands felt both comforting and ominous. I knew there was no turning back now. I had chosen to face the darkness head on, to challenge the Keeper of the Souls and break the curse that had plagued Necropolis for so long. With a determined breath, I took a step forward and descended the ladder into the crypt. After a long descent, I was greeted by a metal door with enchanting depictions carved on it. I used the key to open the gate. Beyond the gate, the air was damp and musty. The walls lined with ancient stone shelves holding ornate coffins. Dim torchlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. The crypt seemed like a place forgotten by time, a hidden sanctuary of secrets and whispers. I followed the path, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the chamber. The crypt was vast, and I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. The journey was a mix of anticipation and unease, but I knew that each step I took brought me closer to the first of 3 objects I needed to break the curse. Eventually, I reached the heart of the crypt, a circular chamber with a pedestal at its center. The pedestal held an object that seemed out of place amidst the gloomy surroundings. A polished silver amulet, intricately engraved with symbols and patterns. Its soft glow seemed to ward off the darkness, offering a glimmer of hope. I approached the amulet with cautious reverence, the book's words echoing in my mind. This was the first object I needed. As I picked up the amulet, a surge of energy coursed through me, as if the amulet's power resonated with mine. I felt a connection to something ancient and powerful, a connection that would aid me on my quest to confront the Keeper of Souls. The path ahead was still uncertain, and the challenges that awaited me were undoubtedly formidable. But I had taken the first step, and I held the key to unlocking the curse's grip on Necropolis. As I held the amulet in my hand, a sense of purpose filled my heart. The weeping girl, the tormented souls, this was their chance for salvation, and I was determined to be their beacon of hope. With the amulet in my possession, and both the key and book now at my side, I turned to leave the crypt and ascend the ladder back to the mausoleum above. The journey was far from over, and the Keeper of Souls would not relinquish its hold easily. But I was no longer alone in this battle. I carried the strength of the souls that longed for release, the guidance of the bald man, and the determination to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As I emerged from the crypt, the mausoleum's quiet ambiance greeted me once more. The book, the key to the crypt, and the amulet were now my companions, tangible reminders of the path I had chosen. Outside, the sun cast long shadows as the world continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the hidden struggles within Necropolis. I knew that the battle against the curse had just begun, and that the shadows would conspire, the keeper would resist, and danger would lurk around every corner. But I was prepared to face whatever darkness awaited me. The crypt was only the beginning, a symbol of the journey that would lead me deeper into the heart of Necropolis, towards a confrontation that would determine the fate of the trapped souls, and my own.